Hello students, can you recall the last time that you felt stressed? Was it when you were getting late for an exam and you lost your bike keys? Or probably you had a fight with your friend and he or she stopped talking to you for a few days. Well, these are negative instances. Let us take a positive instance. Say for example that you really wanted to perform at the cultural fest in your college. You finally got a chance, you are well prepared, but still before going on to the stage you feel stressed. Confusing, isn't it? Stress when things aren't going well and stress when things are. Well, if you were to go by noted stress researcher Selye, then in fact it is not just limited to positive or negative circumstances, but all through our life, continuously we are experiencing some or the other form of stress. In fact, to quote Selye, the absence of stress is death. Only the dead feel no stress. But the fact remains that much of this stress is so minute, so minor that we are not even aware of it, and we do not even label it as stress, at least in the way we understand it. Today in this lesson, we are going to understand as to what stress is and what is the nature of stress. We'll also have a clear and broad overview of two important theories of stress, that is Walter Cannon's fight or flight response and Selye's general adaptation syndrome. Further, we'll also see the role psychological appraisal plays in the stress experience. Now, stress is a term that has been increasingly used in modern times. Almost every other day or probably several times a day, you may find yourself and those around you describing as to how they are feeling stressed out and burnt out and fatigued. The widespread use of this term has of course made it popular. But the downside is that it has created problems in its clear and definite conceptualization. Stress is a term that was originally used in physical sciences, especially physics. Thanks to the efforts of noted researchers such as Walter Cannon and Selye, this field got extended to other sciences, for example biology, medicine and psychology in the 1920s and 1930s. Now, despite the great deal of research that has happened in this field and despite the fact that it has a widespread use, still definitions of stress continue to vary. Now, if we were to club all the available definitions of stress into groups, we would have three major approaches towards defining stress. The first approach sees stress as a stimulus, something that causes stress or a stressor. For example, it can be a natural disaster, for example, a hurricane or a flood, or a personal disaster, for example, a loss of a loved one or the loss of a job. The second approach towards defining stress sees it as a response or a reaction. It may be a psychological response, for example, feelings of anxiety, trauma and distress, or it can be a physiological response, for example, sleeplessness, loss of appetite, high blood pressure and so on. A third approach towards defining stress sees it as an interaction between the individual and the environment and depending upon the appropriateness between the individual and his environment. In other words, this means that if an individual has a high level of appropriateness to his environment, he will feel a lesser amount of stress. For example, some people flourish in highly stressful and competitive environments where they have to meet a lot of deadlines and where there is a high level of competition. On the other hand, in the same environment, a person who prefers a relaxed and predictable work atmosphere will feel highly stressed. Now, how do we club all these three approaches into a single definition of stress? Psychologist Margaret K. Snooks provides a very good definition. She differentiates between stress and stressor. She defines stress as a physical and psychological reaction to a threat to physical, psychological or social health. The stressor she defines as an event or situation perceived by persons as to be a danger to their physical, social or psychological health. We can see that in this definition, stress is a reaction, it is a stimulus, and the perception or interpretation of the event by the individual is also given due consideration. Now that we have defined stress, we'll try to understand some other facts about stress. For example, stress can be conceptualized both in objective and subjective terms. An objective conceptualization of stress focuses on the commonalities of the stress experience between different people. For example, you and your friend both have to attend a job interview. You have little time to prepare. You are feeling nervous and anxious, and so is she. That is the common aspect of your stress experience. Now, you have a moderate level of nervousness and anxiety, and you're able to do fairly well in the interview. On the other hand, her nervousness and anxiety is very high, she gets flustered, she can't answer a few questions and even gets a tension headache later on. So that is her stress experience. There are differences between the two. This is a subjective conceptualization of stress where we focus on the uniqueness of each individual's stress experience. Also, stress can be either dynamic or static. Researchers who view stress as a static concept see it as coming from a particular isolated event, for example, the death of a loved one or bankruptcy. On the other hand, those who view it as a dynamic and ongoing process see it as a continuous interaction between the individual and his environment. Every moment the individual has to face a great deal of stressors. Some are mild, some are severe, they may come from various sources, and he tries his own mechanisms of dealing with it. At times he is successful and at times he is not. Now that we have a broad overview of what stress is, let us go over and see what are the different types of stress. Now we can attempt a classification of stress on two bases. First is the intensity of the stress experience, and the second is the nature of the stress experience. On the basis of the intensity of the stress experience, stress can be classified into two types. The first is acute stress and the second is chronic stress. Acute stress is generally stress that is related to a particular traumatic event. For example, a financial crisis, the loss of a loved one. Chronic stress is stress which occurs from long-time stressful situations. Examples could be poverty, ailing for a disabled member of the family, or growing up in a dysfunctional or broken family. Now, another thing that needs to be understood is that a series of smaller acute stressors, when they occur in close proximity with each other and when they require repeated efforts at adaptation, can lead to chronic stress. Now, even though acute stress can cause a great deal of psychological problems and physiological illnesses, the fact remains that chronic stress is by and far more hazardous, and it can lead to a great number and a great frequency of physiological and psychological debilitations. Another type of stress is the episodic acute stress. It is a more severe type of acute stress. People suffering from this kind of stress experience stress symptoms not just once in a while, but they may experience it even daily. Now we go to the second basis of the classification of stress. It is the nature of the stress experience, and we come to the all-important question: is all stress bad? If your answer is no, then yes, you are right, because all stress isn't bad. Noted American psychologist Richard Lazarus differentiated between eustress or positive stress and distress or negative stress. Now, what is eustress? Eustress or positive stress is short-term and motivates the individual, feels pleasant, and focuses our own concentration and energies, and as a result our performance improves. For example, getting married or having children. The second example is distress. Now, distress is the kind of stress which can be short-term or long-term, and it is essentially unpleasant. It taxes our coping abilities and our performance declines, and there can be physiological and psychological problems along with it. Examples of distress can be loss of a job, or it can be the loss of a loved one, a major accident, a major illness, and so on. Now, we generally think that eustress and distress are two different concepts, but the fact is that there are a number of interlinkages between the two. Now, let me tell you that even though eustress is good, too much of eustress can be taxing. There remains no more fun in the challenge, you get really tense, and in fact it can be distressing and your body gets really taxed up. Similarly, even so-called distressing situations can have eustressing components. For example, research during the Second World War showed that events such as the Second World War, which are extremely traumatic both on the societal level as also on the personal level, even in such events, there were eustressing components. Now, what are the eustressing components, you may ask? There was a development of coping skills, a development of hardiness, and a development of a sense of unity and oneness among the people. Now, let me show you a figure. This is the Yerkes-Dodson curve developed by Robert Yerkes and John Dodson in 1908. Now, this curve shows that when eustress goes beyond a particular limit, then performance declines. Up to a particular extent, eustress or a greater deal of arousal leads to an improvement in performance. But beyond that limit, if eustress or any kind of arousal increases, performance declines. Now that we have understood the different types of stress, we will try to understand what are the different types of stressors. Now, stressors can be chronic or acute, they can be controllable or uncontrollable, and they can be positive or negative. Stressors are most likely to adversely affect your health when they are chronic, when they are negative, and they are unpredictable and uncontrollable. Now, how can we divide the stressors? We can broadly divide them into two groups: external stressors and internal stressors. Now, which are the external stressors? There are three major kinds of external stressors. The first, crises or catastrophes. These are unforeseen, they are unpredictable, uncontrollable, and the individual finds it very difficult to cope with them. Examples include natural disasters such as hurricanes or floods or earthquakes, or man-made disasters such as wars. Those crises and catastrophes are quite rare. When they occur, they bring with them a great deal of stress. The second type of stressor is our major life events. Now, major life events may be positive, such as marriage or birth of children or going to college for the first time, or they may be negative. For example, a bankruptcy, a major accident, or a major illness. Now, research by Cohen et al. Reveals that when stressors in the form of major life events are negative, and when they are chronic in the sense that they have occurred a few months ago, then they are more likely to cause a great deal of stress. The third kind of external stressor are daily hassles or annoyances. We actually face it every moment of our life: annoyances, frustrations, irritations. For example, you are standing in the traffic light and there is a long line, or there is a long queue when you are waiting to pay your bills, or there is a traffic jam. You encounter so many irritating personalities every day. You have such a lot of conflicts. So the hassles are many. And even though we may not assign a great deal of importance to them, still they do cause a substantial amount of stress. And also, hassles are different for different people. Different people handle the same problems in different ways. Now that we have seen what external stressors are, we will try to understand what are the internal stressors. Now, we generally think of stressors as being external to us. But the fact remains that stress is caused by an active interaction between the individual and his environment. For instance, our attitudes, our beliefs, our perceptions, expectations, factors such as locus of control, personality traits, all of these may act as stressors by influencing the way in which we view external events, whether we perceive them as stressors or whether we do not label them as stressors. And if we do label them as stressors, what intensity do we assign to them, and what are the coping methods that we use in order to deal with these stresses. Now we come to the sources of stress. The sources of stress, as simply as can be said, may incorporate almost every other facet of our life. They can be external stressors, for example, crowding, noise, pollution, loss, either physical or material or emotional, problems in personal relationships, illnesses, difficulties in coping and overburdening because a lot of work stress is there, or it may include any other problem that we or others close to us face. And as I've already mentioned before, the other source of stressors may be our own internal factors, our personality factors, our attitudes, our beliefs, our perceptions, our expectations, and the way in which we actually view the world, whether it is optimistic or whether it is pessimistic. Now you may ask me a question, do we actually adapt to stress? Can we really cope with stress? Well, the answer is optimistic. Yes, we can. And in fact, most of the people adapt fairly well to moderate and unpredictable stressors, and in fact that is the kind of stressors we usually face in our lives. But the fact remains that if stressors are intense, they are severe and they are unpredictable, then we surely may have a lot of problems in adapting to them. One another thing we need to remember is that certain disadvantaged people, for example children, elderly or other disadvantaged populations, for example disabled people or poor people, they may find it more difficult to adapt to stress. You may ask why. The reason is that their coping resources are limited. They cannot exercise as much control on the environment as we do, and also their own personal skills and abilities to cope with stress is limited. The photograph that you are now seeing is of famous American physiologist Walter Bradford Cannon. In the 1900s, Walter Cannon defined stress in terms of a response to a stimulus, especially in emergency situations where the individual is required to cope with danger. This response he termed as crucial stress or the fight or flight response. Now, what happens in this fight or flight response? When the body perceives a stressor, the hypothalamus activates two important systems. The one is the sympathetic nervous system within the autonomic nervous system, and the second is the adrenal cortical system. The activation of these two systems leads to the secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla, and glucocorticoids such as cortisol and nearly 30 other hormones from the adrenal cortex. The secretion of these hormones brings about a wide variety of physiological changes. For instance, the rate and intensity of cardiac contraction increases, and as a result your blood pressure increases, the rate of respiration increases, the gastrointestinal activity declines, your sweat glands get activated, blood sugar increases, and blood is diverted from the internal organs to the skeletal muscles along with dilation of the pupils. Now, this physiological arousal is extremely adaptive in the sense that it helps the individual either fight the danger by attacking it or escape from it or flight. Now, once the stressor has passed or the threat is no longer there, then parasympathetic activation starts. The parasympathetic activity takes center stage, and it is useful in bringing the body back to a state of normalcy or homeostasis. Relaxation and bodily balance are brought about. Now, this physiological arousal, which comprises the fight or flight response and mobilizes the body for an intense motor activity in the face of stress, is extremely adaptive, because it helps the individual or the organism defend himself against the stressor. But when stressors occur in close proximity with each other, it leads to a frequent and continued arousal. Such an arousal leads to a continued disruption of the internal state of bodily balance or homeostasis. The result is neurological, hormonal, and immune system debilitation, and the individual becomes vulnerable to a large number of illnesses and diseases, both psychological and physiological. The photograph that you are now seeing is of pioneering Hungarian endocrinologist Hans Selye. From the 1930s to his death in 1982, Hans Selye researched and popularized the concept of stress. Inspired by the works of Claude Bernard and Walter Cannon on homeostasis and deriving inspiration from his own experiments on mice, Selye found that while a number of stimuli can lead to the stress experience, the pattern of the stress experience is always the same. One of Selye's most important contributions is the development of a model of how the body defends itself in stressful situations. This model is the general adaptation syndrome, and consists of 3 stages: the alarm stage, the resistance stage, and the exhaustion stage, as you can see in the graph. The first stage is the alarm stage. You can see in the graph that the line is going up, and the bodily activity also follows the same pattern. During this stage, the body is mobilized to respond to a stressor, and this mobilization is achieved by an activation of the sympathetic nervous system. There is an activation of the adrenal and thymus glands, a secretion of corresponding hormones, and there are a number of physiological changes. For example, the blood sugar levels rise, the blood pressure rises, the rate of respiration, the increases, gastrointestinal activity declines, and so also the rate of salivation declines, your sweat glands get activated, blood is diverted towards the skeletal muscles, and in short, your body is mobilized to actually face the stressor. Either you have to attack it or you have to escape from it, but in any way you have to defend yourself from the stressor. These physical reactions, which comprise the alarm stage in Selye's model, are extremely adaptive. But the fact is, they are most adaptive when the stressor is short term. But in normal life situations, you know that the stressors that we face are generally long term. So in such situations, this continued arousal of the alarm stage can be extremely hazardous to our health. The second stage, as you can see in the graph, is the resistance stage. The line is constant, and the body, in other words, is trying to adjust and adapt itself to the stressor. This may be either by using, the individual may do this either by using his or her own skills, or may try to see what coping resources does he have and what changes can he bring about in the environment. How long this resistance stage lasts depends upon how severe the stressor is, and also on how much ability or coping capacity the individual has. Now, if the stressor persists for a long time, the individual's coping capacity starts becoming lesser and lesser. What is the result? The result is that there will be neurological and hormonal changes, and your immune system weakens. And so you become vulnerable to a large number of illnesses and diseases. It may be hyperthyroidism, ulcerative colitis, gastric and peptic ulcers, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disorders, and say what not. You can have almost a host of illnesses. And in fact, Selye referred to these illnesses as diseases of adaptation, diseases that an individual has when he tries to adapt to the stressor in the resistance stage. Now, the third stage in Selye's model is the exhaustion stage. Now, the organism has tried to resist the stressor, and the stressor has persisted for a long time. Now, a body's capacity to resist the stressor is limited, it is finite. In the exhaustion stage, the capacity to resist the stressor gets totally depleted due to prolonged and intense use, and there is a stage of breakdown. Normally, after the sympathetic activation that is characterized by the alarm stage, there is a parasympathetic activation. It helps to bring the body back to a normal state or the state of homeostasis. But what happens in this exhaustion stage is that since the sympathetic activation has been so prolonged in the alarm and resistance stages, and also because it has been so intense, abnormally intense in fact, the parasympathetic activation is abnormally low, and hence the body is incapable of bringing itself back to a state of normalcy. Now, if the body is not provided extra energy resources to cope with the stressor, or the bodily resources are not replenished, or if an additional stressor occurs at this stage, then the results can be hazardous. According to Selye, it can result in depression, in illnesses, and even in death. Now, let us evaluate Selye's model. How much relevance does it hold for us today? Selye's model was a biological model. It focused on the bodily mechanisms of responding to stress, and no doubt it was an influential model, and it actually gave rise to a great deal of further research. But the negative point in Selye's model was that while overemphasizing on the biological underpinnings of stress, he neglected the psychological aspects. Secondly, he conducted his experiments on non-human subjects, mice, because of ethical reasons, and he tried to equate these results to human subjects, and because of this he faced a great deal of criticism. because when he was conducting experiments on non-human subjects, he could not understand in any way the importance of psychological factors such as perception, higher cognitive abilities such as interpretation of the event, emotions, attitudes, beliefs and perceptions which modulate the stress experience. Now we'll try to understand what is the importance of psychological appraisal or interpretation in the stress experience. A psychological or cognitive appraisal of stress involves a thoughtful evaluation of the extent to which a stressor threatens the individual and his level of vulnerability to it. Now this will be determined by the extent to which he has coping resources as also his personal skills in coping with the stressor. Now the role of psychological appraisal was first put forward by noted American psychologist Dr. Richard Lazarus. Dr. Richard Lazarus along with Susan Folkman proposed an interactional view of stress and held that an individual's subjective appraisal or interpretation of the stress producing event is in fact more important than the event in itself. Now we go over some key concepts in psychological appraisal. The first of these concepts is harm, or the psychological or physiological damage that has already been done. This may take the form of physiological or psychological illnesses or injury. The second is threat, or the anticipation of harm, the extent to which you feel that a stressor can harm you. The third is challenge, or the extent to which the individual feels confident about his abilities to cope with the stressor. Now, an event will be interpreted or perceived as a stressor when it has caused a certain degree of harm and it is perceived as threatening as well as challenging, either in the individual's present interpretations or perceptions or either in his past experiences. Now, Lazarus and Folkman believed that people undertake a psychological appraisal of stress in three ways. The three stages of a psychological appraisal of stress are primary appraisal, secondary appraisal, and reappraisal. Let us see what happens in primary appraisal. In the primary or the first interpretation or appraisal of the event, the individual tries to understand as to what possible negative implications the event has for him, whether or not it can be labeled or classified as a stressor. If the answer is yes, then yes, he feels a lot of stress. For example, if the individual has lost his job, he may ask himself that what threat does it hold for me? If he feels that no, my finances are very secure, I don't really need the job and I really dislike the job, then he will feel the least amount of stress. On the other hand, if he interprets it as stressful, say he feels my finances are not at all good, I really needed the job and I don't know when I can find another job. In such cases, the appraisal will be negative and he feels a lot of distress. In the secondary appraisal of the event, the person tries to determine as to what coping resources and abilities does he have to adapt to the stressor. For example, he may ask himself, if I have lost a job, do I have enough opportunities and abilities to get a new job? If the answer is yes, then he will feel a lesser amount of stress. If the answer is no, if he feels that he will find it really difficult to get another job and the opportunities are really less, then he will feel a greater amount of stress. Now, the third stage of appraisal is the reappraisal. Reappraisal occurs when the individual gets new information which can bring about changes in the initial appraisal. For example, we'll continue with the example of the loss of a job. If the individual sees a newspaper report which says that companies are looking for employees having the same qualification that he has, then this information is positive. It will lead to a further decrease in stress. On the other hand, if he finds out that companies are really unwilling to hire new employees, then the level of stress increases and he feels more stress as compared to the initial appraisal. Thus, the theories of the psychological appraisal of stress hold that stress occurs as a result of an interaction between the individual and his environment, and this interaction determines whether or not he will perceive a certain event as a stressor, and if he perceives it as a stressor, what level of importance will he assign to it, and what other coping mechanisms will he use to adapt to the stressor.